I told my daughter I was heading up to the mountain cabin for the week, loaded my SUV, and drove away. But 40 miles out, I turned around. That night, my neighbor Betty pressed a folded note into my palm and whispered, "Wait until midnight. Your daughter will show you everything." When midnight finally came, what I saw happening under my own roof left me shaking. Not from fear, from absolute clarity. My name is Martha Griffin. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in this 4-bedroom house for 30 years. My husband passed away a decade ago. Since then, I've maintained the property myself. I enjoy my quiet routines, my garden, and my independence. 10 months ago, my daughter Sarah and her husband David asked to move in. David had lost his job, and their apartment lease was up. They just needed a place to reset. Sarah promised 6 months, maximum. I agreed. She was my only child, but the subtle shifts started almost immediately. First, it was the grocery shopping. I bought the food, but Sarah rearranged the pantry, tossing out my favorite brands because they didn't fit her diet. Then, my sewing room became David's gaming space. I didn't argue. I just moved my sewing machine to my bedroom. I am not a woman who looks for conflict. I observe. And I started noticing how Sarah spoke to me. Not as a mother, but as a minor inconvenience in her day. If I sat in the living room reading, she would turn up the television. If I cooked a meal, they would order takeout and eat it at the kitchen island, ignoring the dining table I had set. I tolerated it, waiting for the 6-month mark. But the deadline came and went. David found a new job, yet they made no move to leave. Then, last week, I caught David measuring the dimensions of my master bedroom while I was supposedly out gardening. He jumped when he saw me. That evening, I decided to test the waters. At dinner that night, Sarah brought up her in-laws. David's parents, Arthur and Helen, lived in a rental across town. Their landlord was raising the rent, and Sarah sighed heavily, poking at her salad. "They just can't afford it anymore," she noted, looking at David. "It's a shame this house has so much empty space. You barely use the upstairs." "Mom," I set my fork down. "I use my bedroom and my office. The upstairs is perfectly occupied." "Well, sure, but a single person doesn't need 3,000 square feet," Sarah countered. "It just makes practical sense to consolidate." Consolidate? The word hung in the air. She wasn't asking for my opinion. She was planting a seed for a decision she had already made. I looked at David. He kept his eyes glued to his plate, chewing mechanically. He never challenged Sarah, always letting her steer the ship while he enjoyed the ride. I didn't argue. I simply picked up my plate, rinsed it in the sink, and went to my room. I realized then that I had become a guest in my own home. My daughter didn't see me as the owner. She saw me as the current occupant holding up her plans. The next morning, I noticed my antique hallway table was missing. Sarah had moved it to the garage to make room for a massive shoe rack she bought online. When I asked her about it, she barely looked up from her phone. "It was outdated. Mom, we need something functional." We. The pronoun stung, but it also clarified things. I didn't waste breath demanding she put it back. You cannot negotiate respect with someone who feels entitled to your belongings. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, poured my coffee, and made an announcement. "I'm feeling a bit restless. I think I'll head up to the cabin in the mountains for a week or so. Leave you two to yourselves." Sarah's head snapped up. A wide, genuine smile spread across her face. "Oh, Mom, that sounds like a wonderful idea." Sarah beamed. "You really need a break. We'll take care of everything here. Don't rush back. She was too eager. By noon, she was actively helping me pack, pulling my suitcase from the closet and asking if I needed extra blankets for the cold mountain air. She practically ushered me out the front door. I hugged her goodbye, got into my SUV, and drove out of my neighborhood. I took the highway heading east, exactly as I said I would. I stopped for gas about 40 miles out, sitting in the parking lot with my hands resting on the steering wheel. Something was fundamentally wrong. The way she had smiled, the way David had quickly moved his car out of the driveway to give me a clear path, almost rushing me off the property. I didn't turn the key in the ignition. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor Betty. Betty and I had lived across the street from each other for nearly 3 decades. She missed nothing. Betty, I started. Has Sarah been having people over while I'm out? Betty paused. I wasn't going to say anything. Martha. But yes. The in-laws. They were over yesterday while you were at the dentist. They were looking at your garden, pointing at things. I thanked her, hung up, and turned the car around. I didn't go back to my driveway. I parked 2 streets over, grabbed a small overnight bag, and walked through the alley to Betty's back door. She let me in without a word, her face tight with concern. We sat in her dark living room, looking through the front window at my brightly lit house. My car was gone. To the world. Martha Griffin was in the mountains. Betty handed me a cup of tea and a folded note she had scribbled earlier. Wait until midnight, she whispered. Your daughter will show you everything. The hours ticked by slowly. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside my home, I could see movement through the living room curtains. Sarah and David were pacing, busy. At 11:30, Betty went to bed, leaving me alone in the dark with my thoughts. I felt a strange calm settling over me. 30 years I had poured into that house. Every brick, every plank of hardwood held a memory of my husband and our life together. Now, it was just a stage for someone else's play. Exactly at midnight, a large box truck turned onto our quiet street. Its headlights clicked off as it rolled slowly to a stop right in front of my driveway. I sat forward, the tea turning cold in my hands. The doors of the truck opened, and Arthur and Helen stepped out. David's parents. They weren't just visiting. They were dressed in work clothes. David hurried out of my front door, followed closely by Sarah. They greeted each other warmly, exchanging quick hugs before rolling up the back door of the truck. I watched my son-in-law pull a dolly out. Together, the 4 of them began unloading furniture. A heavy oak dresser, several large plastic storage bins, a mattress. They were moving in. But that wasn't what made my stomach drop. What truly shocked me was where they were carrying the items. They didn't go toward the guest room upstairs. They bypassed the front stairs entirely. The lights flipped on in my master bedroom on the ground floor. Through the large bay window, I watched my daughter instruct her father-in-law on where to place the heavy dresser. She pointed directly to the spot where my husband's antique armchair had sat for 20 years. I pressed my hand against the cool glass of Betty's window. My daughter hadn't just invited her in-laws to live with us. She had given them my room. I watched for 2 hours as they systematically dismantled my personal sanctuary. David and Arthur carried out my belongings in thick black garbage bags. They didn't bother with boxes or care. They dragged my clothes, my books, and the small wooden chest containing my husband's letters out the side door and tossed them into the damp, unheated garage. Sarah followed them, carrying my bedside lamps. She dumped them on a workbench. I didn't cry. Tears require a sense of loss, and what I felt was purely an awakening. The daughter I had raised, the one I had fed, clothed, and welcomed back into my home when she stumbled, had completely erased me from my own house the moment she thought I wasn't looking. At 2 a.m, the moving truck drove away. The lights in my master bedroom finally clicked off. They were going to sleep in the space they had stolen. Betty came downstairs in her robe, rubbing her eyes. She looked out the window, then looked at my face. "Do you want me to call someone?" she asked softly. "I can help you file a report. That's trespassing." "No," I replied, my voice steady. I didn't need authorities to handle my household. Involving third parties just gives people like Sarah a stage to play the victim, to cry misunderstandings and drag things out. I wasn't going to argue with her, and I certainly wasn't going to listen to her excuses. "I'm going to handle it myself," I told Betty. "I just need a few hours of sleep. And your spare key." I lay on Betty's guest bed, staring at the ceiling. I mentally cataloged everything I owned. The names on the utility bills, the deed in my safety deposit box. They had taken my bedroom, thinking possession was ownership. They forgot who actually owned the ground they were standing on. The next morning broke crisp and clear. I sat at Betty's kitchen table with a notepad, tracking the movements across the street. At exactly 8 o'clock, David's car pulled out of the driveway. He was heading to his new office. At 8:30, Sarah left for her yoga class and a brunch appointment she had mentioned days ago. That left Arthur and Helen. I waited. At 10:15, Arthur and Helen emerged, dressed casually. They got into their sedan and drove off, likely exploring their new neighborhood. My neighborhood. The house was completely empty. I stood up, thanked Betty for the coffee, and walked across the street. My shoes clicked sharply against the pavement. I pulled my house key from my pocket and unlocked the front door. The smell hit me first. Helen had plugged in a heavy, floral air freshener in the hallway, masking the familiar scent of cedar I always used. I walked straight to the master bedroom. My bed had been stripped. Their bulky mattress sat on my frame. Unpacked boxes littered the floor, and Helen's clothes were already hanging in my closet, pushing my few remaining winter coats into the corner. I walked out to this garage. There were the black trash bags, piled haphazardly next to the lawnmower. I opened one. My silk blouses, wrinkled and shoved inside. The box of my husband's letters sat dangerously close to a leaky oil pan. They treated my life like debris. I walked back inside, took a deep breath, and pulled out my phone. I didn't call Sarah. I didn't call David. I called a local junk removal and moving company I had used years ago when clearing out the attic. "I need a crew immediately," I told the dispatcher. "I have a lot of items that need to be moved out of my house. I'm paying cash. Double your emergency rate if you can be here in 20 minutes. The moving crew arrived in a heavy-duty box truck. 3 burly men stepped out, looking ready for work. I met them at the door with a stack of $100 bills. "Everything in the master bedroom goes out," I instructed. "The mattress, the dresser, the boxes, the clothes. I want it all stacked neatly on the front lawn." The crew boss blinked, looking at the nice neighborhood. "You sure?" "Ma'am. Looks like somebody just moved it in." "I'm positive." They worked fast. Within an hour, Arthur and Helen's entire life was sitting on the grass near the sidewalk. I didn't let the crew stop there. We moved upstairs to the guest room, Sarah and David's room. I told the men to pack everything that belonged to my daughter and son-in-law into industrial contractor bags. We cleared the closet, the bathroom counter, the desk. Every shoe, every charger, every piece of paperwork. I had them haul it all outside, creating a second massive pile next to the in-laws' belongings. When the house was entirely emptied of their presents, I tipped the men generously and sent them on their way. I then went to the garage and carried my black trash bags back inside. I carefully hung my clothes back in my closet. I placed my husband's letters exactly where they belonged on the bedside table. I reclaimed my space, piece by piece, wiping down the counters and unplugging that awful floral air freshener. I was not angry anymore. The fury had burned off, leaving behind a cold, efficient resolve. I walked into my home office, logged onto my computer, and canceled the family cell phone plan. I removed Sarah as an authorized user on my emergency credit card. Then, I made one final call. The locksmith arrived just after 1 o'clock. I had him rekey every exterior door, the front, the back, and the heavy side door leading to the garage. He swapped the old brass deadbolts for heavy-duty smart locks that required a PIN code. "Lost your keys, ma'am?" he asked politely as he drilled the new plates in. "No," I replied, watching the metal shavings fall. "Just upgrading my boundaries." After he left, I went down to the basement. I located the electrical panel and flipped the breakers for the upstairs bedrooms and the detached garage, cutting the power to the spaces they used to occupy. I clamped a heavy brass padlock onto the panel door. Next, I walked to the living room, unplugged the Wi-Fi router, wrapped its cords tightly, and locked it in my safe, my house, my utilities, my rules. By 3 o'clock, the property was secure. The lawn looked like a chaotic flea market, piled high with contractor bags, an oak dresser, and a bare mattress. I went to the kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and poured it into my favorite ceramic mug. I carried it out to the front porch, pulling up one of the wooden rocking chairs. I sat down, smoothed my slacks, and watched the street. The autumn breeze rustled the oak trees. A few neighbors drove by, slowing down to stare at the bizarre display on my lawn. Betty waved from her window. I raised my mug to her. I didn't have to wait long. At 4:15, Sarah's car turned the corner. She pulled into the driveway and slammed on the brakes so hard the tires squeaked. She stared at the lawn, her mouth falling open. Sarah practically fell out of her car. She ran toward the pile of contractor bags, her eyes wide with panic. "Mom, what? What is this?" She spun toward the porch, finally noticing me sitting there with my coffee. Before I could answer, David's car pulled up, followed closely by Arthur and Helen in their sedan. The driveway was suddenly crowded with confused, angry people. Helen gasped, rushing toward her oak dresser sitting in the grass. "What happened to our things?" Helen shrieked, looking at me. "Martha, did someone break in?" "Nobody broke in," I said, setting my mug down on the side table. My voice carried easily over the lawn. "You moved my belongings out of my bedroom. I simply returned the favor." Sarah marched up the porch steps, her face flushed red. "Are you insane? You were supposed to be at the cabin. We were reorganizing. Arthur and Helen needed a place to stay." "In my bedroom," I stated clearly, throwing my husband's memories into the damp garage like garbage. David stepped forward, looking terrified. "Martha, please, we can explain. We just thought since you were gone." You thought I wouldn't notice. I interrupted. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. You thought you could quietly push me out of my own home, but you forgot one simple fact. You don't own this house. You don't pay the bills here. Sarah lunged for the front door handle, jiggling it violently. It didn't turn. Open this door right now, she demanded. All my stuff is inside. We live here. You lived here, I corrected her. Past tense. Your temporary stay has expired. Every item you own is in those bags. Your father-in-law's furniture is right where he left it. You have until dark to get it off my property. For a moment, nobody moved. The reality of the situation washed over them. There would be no argument, no tearful negotiation, no period of transition. The boundary was set in stone. You can't do this to your own daughter, Sarah yelled, her voice finally cracking. Where are we supposed to go? You should have thought about that before you evicted me from my bedroom, I replied smoothly. I picked up my mug. Also, your cell phones will stop working by midnight. The plan was in my name. Arthur cursed under his breath and started making a phone call, likely looking for a rental truck. Helen stood by her mattress, looking mortified. David refused to make eye contact with me, silently grabbing bags and dragging them toward his car. Sarah stood on the bottom step, glaring at me. She wanted a fight. She wanted me to scream so she could call me unreasonable. I just smiled, a small, polite smile, and went back inside. I locked the heavy new deadbolt behind me. I watched through the peephole as they scrambled. It took them 3 hours and a rented U-Haul to clear the lawn. They drove away just as the sun set, leaving the yard empty and quiet. It has been 6 weeks since that afternoon. Sarah hasn't called, and I haven't reached out. Some friends tell me I should forgive her. That family is family, but I know better. Family doesn't put you in the garage. My home is peaceful again. The floral air freshener is gone, replaced by the smell of cedar. I drink my coffee on the porch every morning, looking at the garden I built with my husband. I didn't need anyone else to fight my battles. I just needed the courage to close the door. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and drop a comment down below to let us know what you would have done.